You people and your cheap skills, any monkey could do this job. Vincent Ashford's words cut through the upscale restaurant like a blade. His Armani suit and Patek Philippe watch gleaming under crystal chandeliers as he humiliated the waitress serving his table. What he didn't know was that Sophia Bennett had a PhD in biochemistry from MIT tucked in her back pocket, literally. Her thesis defense was tomorrow morning. The billionaire pharmaceutical executive continued his performance, live streaming his cruelty for social media entertainment while discussing drug development deals worth millions. He had no idea the uneducated woman refilling his water glass understood every dangerous flaw in his acquisition strategy. Some mistakes cost money, others cost lives. Subscribe to see what happens when expertise meets ignorance, and why Vincent Ashford would never recover from underestimating the wrong person. Sophia Bennett balanced the heavy tray with practiced ease, weaving between tables at Le Bernardin. 3 years of waiting tables had taught her to read customers instantly. The man in the corner booth, Armani suit, Patek Philippe watch, was trouble. "Excuse me," he snapped his manicured fingers. "Are you even listening? I said no ice." She'd heard him the first time. "Of course, sir. I'll fix that immediately." He leaned back, smirking. "You people and your cheap skills. Carrying plates, memorizing orders. Any monkey could do this job." His companions chuckled. Sophia's grip tightened on the tray. The PhD in biochemistry from MIT felt heavy in her back pocket, literally. Her thesis defense was tomorrow morning. She set down his drink with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Time to show him what cheap skills really look like. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. This story hits different depending on where you've been underestimated. The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the mahogany tables, each reflection sharp as the edge in Vincent Ashford's voice when he addressed the waitstaff. Sophia had learned his name from the reservation book, tech billionaire, pharmaceutical investments, the kind of money that bought silence when convenient. His dinner companions nodded along to his commentary about service standards declining, their laughter a chorus of practice sycophancy. The restaurant hummed with the quiet efficiency of a machine designed to separate the wealthy from their money while making them feel superior to those who served them. Sophia moved through this choreographed dance with the fluid precision of someone who understood the performance was everything, even as her mind cataloged the casual cruelty in every gesture. The irony wasn't lost on her that she spent her days bringing sustenance to people who would never think to ask if she needed feeding herself. Vincent's voice carried across the dining room as he gestured expansively, his Hermes cufflinks catching the light. "The problem with hiring from certain backgrounds," he said, ensuring his words reached beyond his immediate table, "is that you can't expect the kind of refined service our father's generation took for granted." Sophia felt the familiar heat rise in her chest. Not anger, exactly, but something sharper. Recognition. She'd grown up in Youngstown, Ohio, where her mother Diane worked double shifts at the steel plant to keep their trailer park rental current. First-generation college meant every scholarship application, every work-study job, every moment of this exact humiliation was a calculated investment in a future that men like Vincent assumed belonged exclusively to their children. The weight of her student loans pressed against her conscience like a physical force. $60,000 that transformed every slight into a mathematical equation. How much dignity equaled one more semester toward her doctorate? The dinner service continued its relentless rhythm while Sophia absorbed Vincent's performance of superiority. He ordered the $70 Wagyu, then complained about the temperature. He demanded a wine pairing, then questioned her knowledge of the vintage. Each interaction was designed to reinforce the hierarchy that placed him above her. His wealth a fortress wall that rendered her invisible, except as an object of casual disdain. His companions, a pharmaceutical executive and a venture capitalist, judging by their conversation, encouraged his behavior with the particular enthusiasm of people who understood their social position depended on maintaining clear distinctions between themselves and the help. Sophia watched them discuss their latest acquisition targets with the detached precision of surgeons. Their casual mention of drug pricing and market manipulation a soundtrack to her own mounting awareness that she was witnessing something far more significant than garden-variety classism. The conversation shifted toward business as Sophia cleared their appetizer plates, her movements invisible to men accustomed to service without acknowledgement. Vincent's voice took on the confident cadence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room as he outlined his company's latest pharmaceutical acquisition strategy. The beauty of targeting smaller biotech firms, he explained to his companions, is that their research teams are typically too academic to understand real market dynamics. We acquire their compounds, streamline the development process, and bring products to market faster than they ever could. Sophia's hand paused almost imperceptibly as she reached for Vincent's wine glass. Her thesis research focused on precisely the kind of cancer drug compounds Vincent was describing, and the numbers he was citing, trial phases, efficacy rates, safety margins, were wrong. Not slightly off, but fundamentally, dangerously incorrect. The weight of her hidden knowledge felt suddenly enormous as Sophia continued her service rounds, Vincent's voice providing a constant backdrop of misinformation delivered with absolute confidence. He spoke about accelerating Phase 2 trials, about statistical significance in sample sizes too small to be meaningful, about side effect profiles that her own research had shown to be far more severe than his casual dismissal suggested. The academic in her wanted to interrupt, to correct the fundamental misunderstandings that could affect patient safety and treatment outcomes. But the waitress in her, the part that needed this job to survive another month in Manhattan, kept her expression neutral and her opinions to herself. The tension between these two selves had become the defining characteristic of her existence, the constant code switching between the brilliant researcher she was becoming and the service worker she needed to be. Vincent's performance reached its crescendo as he described his company's plans to acquire a small Boston-based firm developing novel cancer therapeutics. "These academic types," he said, his voice loud enough to ensure Sophia heard every word, "they get so caught up in their theoretical models that they lose sight of practical applications. What they need is real-world business sense to guide their work." Sophia bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste copper. The Boston firm he was targeting had developed compounds that represented genuine breakthroughs in targeted cancer therapy, treatments that could extend and improve lives in ways that Vincent's market-first approach would almost certainly compromise. The casual arrogance of his dismissal, reducing years of careful scientific work to theoretical indulgence, crystallized everything wrong with a system that elevated wealth over expertise. As the evening progressed, Sophia found herself caught in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Vincent's dinner companions deferred to his pharmaceutical expertise despite his obvious gaps in understanding, their wealth creating a bubble of assumed competence that insulated them from inconvenient facts. She watched millions of dollars in investment decisions being made based on fundamental misunderstandings of drug development, patient safety protocols, and regulatory requirements that any first-year graduate student in biochemistry would recognize as problematic. The surreal nature of her situation, possessing the knowledge to correct potentially dangerous misconceptions while being dismissed as intellectually incapable of understanding the conversation, felt like a particularly cruel form of gaslighting. Her thesis defense was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning, where she would present 3 years of research on precisely the therapeutic targets Vincent was so confidently misrepresenting. The final course arrived as Vincent's voice grew more animated, his audience more sycophantic, and his claims more outrageous. He spoke about fast-tracking drugs through regulatory approval, about clinical trials as obstacles to profitability rather than patient safety measures, about the pharmaceutical industry's responsibility to shareholders rather than the patients whose lives hung in the balance of their decisions. Sophia felt each misstatement like a physical blow, her scientific training warring with her economic necessity. The check arrived, $437 plus tip, representing more than Sophia earned in a week of 12-hour shifts. Vincent barely glanced at the total before placing his black American Express card on the leather folder, a gesture that confirmed what Sophia had already understood. Money insulated him from consequences in ways that rendered expertise irrelevant. Tomorrow morning, she would defend research that could save lives. Tonight, she served dessert to a man whose ignorance might end them. The morning shift at Le Bernardin started before the city woke up. Prep work and inventory checks that prepared the restaurant for another day of expensive theater. Sophia arrived at 5:30, her thesis notes tucked into her bag like a secret she wasn't allowed to share. The defense was scheduled for 3 o'clock, enough time to complete her breakfast service, shower in the staff restroom, and make the subway ride to Cambridge. Professor Helen Caldwell had scheduled the presentation for late afternoon to accommodate Sophia's work schedule, one of countless small kindnesses that made her doctoral program possible. The irony of defending research on cancer therapeutics hours after serving dinner to a man who fundamentally misunderstood cancer treatment wasn't lost on her, but the dual existence had become so routine that the cognitive dissonance barely registered anymore. Vincent Ashford returned for lunch, his presence announced by the hostess's suddenly deferential tone and the subtle reorganization of staff attention that wealth commanded. Sophia watched Gregory Manning, the restaurant manager, personally escort Vincent to the same corner booth he'd occupied the previous evening, his body language radiating the particular anxiety that high-maintenance wealthy customers inspired in hospitality professionals. The pharmaceutical executive from last night's dinner accompanied him, along with 2 new faces that Sophia recognized from business magazines, a venture capitalist whose firm specialized in healthcare investments, and a regulatory consultant whose client list included every major pharmaceutical company. This wasn't a casual lunch. This was Vincent assembling his team for the acquisition he'd discussed with such casual confidence 12 hours earlier. The conversation resumed exactly where it had ended the previous evening, Vincent's voice carrying across the dining room as he outlined his acquisition strategy with the same fundamental misunderstandings that had made Sophia's skin crawl during dinner service. He spoke about streamlining clinical trials, about regulatory capture, about the inefficiencies of academic research institutions that prioritized patient outcomes over profit margins. His companions nodded along with the practiced enthusiasm of people whose financial success depended on agreeing with men like Vincent, regardless of their actual expertise or the consequences of their decisions. Sophia took their drink orders: sparkling water, single malt scotch, an obscenely expensive bottle of Burgundy, while absorbing information that could affect thousands of cancer patients whose treatment options hung in the balance of Vincent's misconceptions. The pharmaceutical executive spread documents across the table as their conversation intensified. Clinical trial data and regulatory filings that Sophia recognized from her own research. The Boston biotech firm Vincent intended to acquire had developed compounds that her thesis research directly complemented. Novel therapeutic approaches that represented genuine scientific breakthroughs rather than incremental improvements designed primarily for patent protection. Watching Vincent dismiss their work as academic indulgence while simultaneously planning to profit from it felt like watching someone torch a library while complaining about the author's lack of commercial sense. The regulatory consultant pointed out potential FDA obstacles, concerns about side effect profiles that Vincent waved away with the confident ignorance of someone who would never personally face the consequences of accelerated drug approval. Sophia's service rounds became increasingly difficult as Vincent's voice grew louder and his claims more outrageous. He described patient safety protocols as bureaucratic obstacles, clinical trial phases as artificial barriers to market entry, and side effect monitoring as excessive caution that prevented life-saving treatments from reaching patients who needed them. The irony was stunning. Vincent genuinely believed his ignorance represented practical wisdom, that his lack of scientific training made him better qualified to make decisions about drug development than the researchers who had dedicated their careers to understanding molecular mechanisms and therapeutic pathways. His wealth had insulated him from correction for so long that he'd lost the ability to distinguish between confidence and competence, between having opinions and possessing knowledge. The situation escalated when Sophia delivered their entrees and Vincent's attention focused directly on her for the first time since the previous evening. "You," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone that wealthy men used when they wanted to demonstrate their power over service workers. "You were here last night. Tell my colleagues, do you think waitresses should have opinions about drug development?" His companions laughed, the sound sharp and exclusionary. Sophia felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a crystalline clarity about exactly who Vincent Ashford was and what he represented. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was designed to humiliate her, to reinforce the social hierarchy that placed his inherited wealth above her earned expertise. The timing felt almost intentionally cruel. 3 hours before she was scheduled to defend research that directly contradicted his confident assertions about cancer treatment. Vincent's performance intensified as he sensed weakness, his voice rising to ensure the entire restaurant could hear his demonstration of social dominance. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he announced to his table while staring directly at Sophia. "People from certain backgrounds, trailer parks, community colleges, public assistants, they develop this sense of entitlement that makes them think their opinions matter in conversations between actual professionals." The pharmaceutical executive shifted uncomfortably, but his silence spoke volumes about the power dynamics at play. Gregory Manning appeared at Sophia's elbow with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing situations where wealthy customers exercise their privilege at staff expense. His apologetic expression told Sophia everything she needed to know about which side the restaurant would choose if forced to pick between her dignity and Vincent's continued patronage. The humiliation crystallized into something approaching performance art as Vincent pulled out his phone and began recording, his voice taking on the theatrical quality of someone creating content for an audience beyond the immediate room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, holding his device to capture Sophia's reaction. "This is what happens when we lower our standards. Service workers who think they're qualified to have opinions about complex subjects they couldn't possibly understand." His companions laughed nervously, but the venture capitalist's discomfort was evident in the way she avoided eye contact with Sophia. The regulatory consultant actually looked ashamed, though not ashamed enough to speak up in defense of basic human dignity. Vincent continued his performance, describing the decline of proper service standards and the entitlement of working-class people who didn't understand their place in the social hierarchy. Gregory Manning's intervention came too late and with too little conviction, his apology to Vincent taking precedence over any concern for Sophia's well-being. "Mr. Ashford, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience," he said, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone whose job security depended on wealthy customer satisfaction. "I'll speak with our staff about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries during service." The implication was clear. Sophia had somehow overstepped by existing in Vincent's presence, by serving his table, while possessing opinions about subjects he'd chosen to discuss loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear. The systemic nature of the humiliation was perfect in its efficiency. Vincent got to demonstrate his social dominance, Gregory got to preserve his customer relationship, and Sophia got to absorb the consequences of their collective cowardice while maintaining her professional composure. The aftermath unfolded with the inevitable momentum of institutional power protecting institutional interests. Gregory's private conversation with Sophia lasted exactly long enough for him to explain that customer complaints could affect her employment, that discretion was essential in fine dining service, that her behavior reflected on the restaurant's reputation. The fact that her behavior had consisted entirely of serving food while possessing undisclosed expertise in the subject Vincent was publicly misrepresenting apparently constituted a firing offense, while his recorded humiliation of a service worker was simply customer preference. Sophia listened to Gregory's carefully worded warning while watching Vincent's table through the kitchen window, his animated conversation continuing as though nothing had happened. The thesis defense was 90 minutes away, and she had a choice to make between the career she'd spent 6 years building and the job she needed to survive the next 6 months. The subway ride to Cambridge felt like traveling between two different versions of herself. The waitress who absorbed humiliation for minimum wage and tips, and the doctoral candidate who could articulate the molecular mechanisms underlying Vincent Ashford's expensive ignorance. Sophia stared at her reflection in the dark window as the train pulled into MIT's station, her server's uniform exchanged for the navy blazer and gray slacks that constituted her academic wardrobe. The clothes were second-hand, carefully selected from thrift stores and consignment shops to project professional competence on a student budget. But they transformed her into someone who belonged in lecture halls and laboratory meetings. The transformation felt almost magical in its completeness. Invisible waitress becoming visible scholar, except for the lingering taste of Vincent's casual cruelty and the knowledge that she would return to Le Bernardin tomorrow morning to face the consequences of existing in his presence. Professor Helen Caldwell's office occupied a corner of the biochemistry building that overlooked the Charles River, floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with afternoon light. Her desk displayed the accumulated artifacts of a distinguished academic career: research awards, conference photos, the casual debris of someone whose intellectual contributions had earned genuine respect in a field dominated by brilliant minds and careful methodology. Sophia had worked as her research assistant for 3 years, contributing to publications that advanced understanding of targeted cancer therapeutics, while learning to navigate the complex relationship between scientific discovery and pharmaceutical application. Professor Caldwell understood both worlds: the pure research that motivated academic inquiry and the commercial realities that brought laboratory discoveries to patients who needed them, which made her perspective on Vincent's acquisition strategy particularly valuable. The thesis defense proceeded with the formal precision that academic rituals demanded, Sophia presenting 3 years of research on novel therapeutic compounds with the confidence that came from genuine expertise. Her work focused on molecular targeting mechanisms that could improve treatment outcomes while reducing the side effects that made current cancer therapies so physically devastating for patients. The research was solid, methodologically sound, and represented exactly the kind of incremental but meaningful advance that characterized responsible pharmaceutical development. Her committee, 5 distinguished professors whose combined expertise spanned decades of biochemical research, asked probing questions that demonstrated their respect for her work and their confidence in her ability to contribute meaningfully to the field. The defense concluded with the kind of warm professional congratulations that marked successful completion of doctoral requirements, handshakes, and promises of recommendation letters that opened doors to postdoctoral positions and industry opportunities. Professor Caldwell lingered after the other committee members departed, her expression shifting from formal academic approval to personal concern. "Sophia," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone that preceded difficult conversations, "I need to ask about something that's been troubling me. There's a video circulating online. Someone recorded what appears to be a humiliation incident at a restaurant. The woman in the video looks remarkably like you." The weight of Vincent's performance art settled over Sophia's moment of academic triumph like a shadow, his casual cruelty extending its reach into the professional space she'd worked so hard to claim. The dual existence that had sustained her through 6 years of graduate school was colliding in ways she hadn't anticipated, her service work contaminating her scholarly identity through the viral amplification of recorded humiliation. The conversation that followed felt like watching her carefully constructed future disintegrate in real time. Professor Caldwell explained the concerns that had emerged within the department, not about Sophia's qualifications or research, which were beyond question, but about the potential impact of viral notoriety on the university's reputation and her own professional prospects. Academic institutions prized discretion above almost everything else, and faculty members whose personal lives attracted negative attention often found their career options quietly but decisively limited. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. Vincent's recorded humiliation of her service work was being used to undermine her scholarly achievements, his wealth and social position allowing him to contaminate both aspects of her dual existence with a single afternoon's performance of casual contempt. The practical implications crystallized as Professor Caldwell outlined the department's concerns with the careful diplomacy that academic professionals used to deliver devastating news. Industry positions that might have been available to a promising new PhD could become complicated if hiring managers associated Sophia with viral controversy rather than research excellence. Postdoctoral fellowships that depended on faculty recommendations might become problematic if her name triggered recognition of online humiliation rather than scientific achievement. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. Vincent's casual cruelty had the power to follow her into every professional space she hoped to enter, his performance art becoming a permanent barrier to the career she'd spent 6 years building through careful work and genuine expertise. Sophia left MIT with a PhD in biochemistry and the growing realization that Vincent Ashford's power extended far beyond his ability to humiliate service workers for entertainment. His casual mentions of the Boston biotech firm during lunch service had revealed acquisition plans that could affect cancer treatment development for thousands of patients. But his fundamental misunderstanding of the science involved made those plans genuinely dangerous. The compounds he intended to acquire through financial leverage rather than scientific understanding represented exactly the kind of therapeutic breakthroughs that her own research supported. Innovations that could improve patient outcomes if developed responsibly and devastate treatment options if rushed to market by executives who prioritized profit over safety protocols. The weight of this knowledge felt enormous as she descended into the subway system, her doctorate suddenly feeling less like an achievement and more like a responsibility she wasn't sure she was prepared to carry. The train ride back to Manhattan provided time to process the collision between her academic accomplishments and Vincent's viral humiliation. The way his recorded cruelty had contaminated her moment of scholarly triumph. Professor Caldwell's warnings about professional reputation felt like a preview of the obstacles that would follow her into every job interview, every professional introduction, every opportunity to contribute her expertise to pharmaceutical development. The video would outlive any research publication, any recommendation letter, any evidence of her actual qualifications and capabilities. Vincent's afternoon entertainment had become a permanent barrier to the career she'd worked so hard to earn. His casual exercise of social dominance extending its reach into professional spaces that were supposed to value merit over social position. But something else had emerged from the conversation with Professor Caldwell. A crystalline understanding of exactly what Vincent represented and why his acquisition strategy constituted more than garden-variety corporate greed. His plans to streamline drug development by eliminating safety protocols weren't just financially motivated. They reflected a fundamental ignorance of why those protocols existed in the first place. His dismissal of academic research as theoretical indulgence revealed a dangerous misunderstanding of how pharmaceutical innovation actually worked, how careful methodology and patient safety considerations produced treatments that helped rather than harmed the people who needed them. The casual confidence with which he'd outlined plans to acquire and accelerate compounds he didn't understand represented exactly the kind of financially motivated recklessness that had produced some of the pharmaceutical industry's most devastating failures. Sophia emerged from the subway into the familiar chaos of Manhattan evening rush hour with a new clarity about her situation. Vincent's humiliation had been designed to reinforce social hierarchies that placed his wealth above her expertise. But it had also revealed something he probably didn't intend. The extent of his ignorance about subjects he was confident enough to discuss publicly and wealthy enough to shape through acquisition and influence. The video that threatened her professional reputation also contained evidence of his fundamental misunderstanding of pharmaceutical development, regulatory requirements, and patient safety protocols. His performance art had been intended to demonstrate his social dominance, but it had also documented his professional incompetence in ways that could matter to people whose decisions affected thousands of cancer patients. The question was whether her expertise was worth more than his wealth in a society that had consistently chosen money over merit. The notification arrived at 6:30 the following morning while Sophia prepared for what she assumed would be another ordinary shift at Le Bernardin. Coffee brewing, uniform pressed, the mental preparation required to transform from newly minted PhD to invisible service worker. Her phone screen displayed a number she didn't recognize, followed by a text message that made her stomach drop. "You're famous, trailer trash. Too bad your fancy degree won't help you now." The message included a link that led to Vincent's video from the previous afternoon. But this version had been edited and amplified, shared across platforms with commentary that transformed her moment of professional humiliation into viral entertainment for an audience that found pleasure in watching service workers get reminded of their place in the social hierarchy. The video had accumulated hundreds of thousands of views overnight, spreading through networks that specialized in content designed to reinforce existing prejudices about class, education, and social mobility. The comments section read like a masterclass in creative cruelty. Speculation about her background, her qualifications, her right to exist in spaces dominated by people who looked and sounded like Vincent Ashford. Strangers had constructed elaborate narratives about her life based on 30 seconds of recorded humiliation, their assumptions revealing more about their own prejudices than anything about her actual circumstances. The viral nature of the content had transformed Vincent's casual afternoon entertainment into a permanent digital monument to the idea that working-class people who possessed opinions about complex subjects deserved public ridicule for their presumption. Gregory Manning's phone call arrived before Sophia had processed the full implications of her overnight transformation from invisible service worker to viral cautionary tale. His voice carried the particular strain of someone delivering news that would protect his business interests while devastating someone else's life circumstances. "Sophia," he said, his tone suggesting regret he didn't actually feel. "I'm afraid we need to discuss your employment status. The incident yesterday has created some complications that affect the restaurant's reputation." The euphemism was perfect in its cowardice. Her existence in Vincent's presence had become an incident. Her humiliation had become a complication, and her employment had become a casualty of viral entertainment that she hadn't chosen to participate in but would bear the consequences of indefinitely. The conversation that followed felt like watching institutional power protect itself through the systematic abandonment of the people it had promised to support. Gregory explained that Le Bernardin couldn't afford to be associated with viral controversy, that fine dining establishments depended on discretion and professional atmosphere, that her continued employment might discourage the kind of clientele the restaurant needed to survive. The fact that Vincent had created the controversy through his own recorded humiliation of a staff member was irrelevant. The fact that Sophia had done nothing except exist while possessing undisclosed expertise was immaterial. What mattered was protecting the restaurant's relationship with wealthy customers who might be uncomfortable knowing that their service workers possessed opinions about subjects the customers chose to discuss publicly during their dining experience. The practical consequences of unemployment hit with the immediacy that people living paycheck to paycheck understood viscerally. Rent on her tiny studio apartment, $800 monthly for 40 square meters of Manhattan real estate, was due in 12 days. Student loan payments, $600 monthly for the privilege of having earned her education through debt rather than inheritance, would continue regardless of her employment status. The credit card debt she'd accumulated to cover the gap between her graduate stipend and actual living expenses, $4,000 that grew larger every month despite minimum payments, represented a financial burden that unemployment would transform from manageable to catastrophic. The careful calculations that had sustained her through 6 years of graduate school were collapsing into the kind of economic emergency that forced immediate choices between long-term goals and short-term survival. Professor Caldwell's follow-up call provided additional evidence that Vincent's viral entertainment was contaminating every aspect of Sophia's professional identity. The department had received inquiries from potential employers who'd seen the video and wanted to know if MIT stood behind graduates who generated negative publicity through their personal behavior. Industry connections who might have provided postdoctoral opportunities were expressing concerns about associating their research programs with viral controversy. Academic conferences that had accepted her presentation proposals were reconsidering their programming decisions based on worries about attracting negative attention. The message was clear. Vincent's casual afternoon performance had created a permanent barrier to the career she'd worked 6 years to earn. His wealth and social position allowing him to destroy professional opportunities through recorded humiliation. The harassment began in earnest as the video continued its viral trajectory, spreading through networks that found entertainment in watching working-class people get reminded of their social position. Messages arrived at all hours. Death threats disguised as moral instruction. Sexual violence fantasized as social correction. Economic sabotage recommended as appropriate punishment for presuming to have opinions about subjects above her station. The creativity of anonymous cruelty was stunning in its precision. Each message designed to remind her that viral notoriety made her vulnerable to consequences that extended far beyond employment termination. The digital mob had found her personal information through techniques that seemed effortless. her address and phone number becoming public knowledge for people who enjoyed participating in the systematic destruction of strangers' lives. Diane Bennett's phone call from Ohio provided the only moment of genuine human connection in a day that felt like watching her life disintegrate in real time. Her mother's voice carried 3 decades of experience with economic uncertainty, job loss, and the particular vulnerability that came with being working class in a society that treated poverty as a moral failing rather than a structural reality. "Sophia," she said, her tone combining love with practical concern. "I don't understand everything that's happening, but I know you didn't deserve this. Come home if you need to. We'll figure something out." The offer was generous in ways that transcended financial calculation. Returning to Ohio would mean abandoning 6 years of investment in her education, but staying in Manhattan without employment might mean abandoning her education anyway, through sheer economic necessity. The evening brought additional evidence of how thoroughly Vincent's performance had contaminated her professional reputation. LinkedIn messages from connections who wanted to distance themselves from viral controversy. Research collaborators who were reconsidering their associations with someone whose name triggered recognition of online humiliation rather than scientific achievement. Industry professionals who'd previously expressed interest in her work were now concerned about the potential impact of hiring someone associated with negative publicity. The systematic nature of the professional isolation was perfect in its efficiency. Vincent's casual exercise of social dominance had created consequences that would follow her into every job interview, every professional introduction, every opportunity to contribute her expertise to pharmaceutical development. But as Sophia sat in her tiny apartment, surrounded by the debris of her carefully constructed life, something crystallized that hadn't been visible during the immediate crisis of viral humiliation and employment termination. Vincent's video contained more than just recorded cruelty. It also documented his confident discussion of pharmaceutical acquisition strategies that reflected fundamental misunderstanding of drug development, patient safety, and regulatory requirements. His casual mention of specific biotech firms, specific compounds, specific plans to streamline development by eliminating safety protocols constituted exactly the kind of evidence that regulatory agencies would find compelling if presented by someone with the expertise to explain why his approach was dangerous. The question was whether her scientific knowledge was worth more than his wealth in institutions that were supposed to prioritize patient safety over corporate profits. The NYC Biotech Innovation Conference occupied 3 floors of the Jacob Javits Convention Center, a gleaming monument to the intersection of scientific discovery and commercial application that attracted pharmaceutical executives, research scientists, regulatory officials, and venture capitalists from across the country. Sophia approached the registration desk with the kind of nervous confidence that came from betting everything on a single strategic decision: her student press credentials, technically valid through her university affiliation, providing access to conversations that could reshape her understanding of how pharmaceutical development actually worked beyond the controlled environment of academic research. The conference badge that hung around her neck felt like armor against the viral humiliation that had destroyed her service job and threatened her professional reputation, a tangible reminder that her expertise existed independently of Vincent Ashford's recorded cruelty. The exhibition hall buzzed with the particular energy that accompanied gatherings of people whose work shaped medical treatment for millions of patients, their conversations carrying weight that extended far beyond quarterly profit reports or academic publication records. Pharmaceutical executives discussed acquisition strategies with the casual confidence of people accustomed to making decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Research scientists presented preliminary findings that could lead to breakthrough treatments or devastating failures, depending on development methodology and safety protocols. Regulatory consultants explained FDA requirements to companies whose understanding of clinical trial phases seemed surprisingly superficial given the stakes involved. The atmosphere felt electric with possibility and terrifying in its implications. Every handshake could affect treatment options for cancer patients whose lives depended on responsible drug development. Vincent Ashford's keynote presentation was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the main auditorium. His topic announced as Streamlining Innovation: How Market-Driven Development Accelerates Patient Access to Life-Saving Treatments. Sophia found a seat in the back row with the calculated invisibility that had become second nature during her years of navigating spaces where she belonged intellectually but not socially, her notebook ready to document the specific claims that could matter to regulatory agencies investigating pharmaceutical misconduct. The auditorium filled with industry professionals whose combined decisions shaped drug development priorities, pricing strategies, and patient access to treatments that could extend or save lives. The weight of their collective influence felt enormous as Vincent took the stage with the confident bearing of someone whose wealth had insulated him from consequences for so long that he'd forgotten the possibility of being wrong. Vincent's presentation exceeded Sophia's worst expectations in terms of dangerous misinformation delivered with absolute confidence to an audience whose expertise should have made his errors obvious. He spoke about clinical trial phases as bureaucratic obstacles rather than patient safety measures, describing FDA oversight as regulatory capture that prevented life-saving treatments from reaching patients who needed them. His slides displayed statistical analyses that were fundamentally flawed, safety data that had been selectively interpreted, and efficacy claims that ignored established scientific methodology. The audience's reception was politely attentive. Their questions focused on implementation details rather than the underlying assumptions that made his entire approach problematic. The systematic failure of expertise in the face of wealth and confidence was stunning to witness. Professionals whose training should have made them skeptical were instead asking how they could apply his methods to their own development programs. The question and answer session provided Sophia's opportunity to transform from invisible observer to active participant, her hand rising with the kind of determination that came from understanding exactly what was at stake. "Dr. Ashford," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the auditorium despite her position in the back row. "Your presentation references accelerated development timelines that seem to compress Phase 2 and Phase 3 clinical trials beyond FDA requirements. Could you explain how you maintain statistical significance in efficacy measurements while reducing sample sizes and observation periods?" The question was precisely calibrated to expose the fundamental flaws in his methodology, without revealing the depth of her expertise. A professional inquiry that any qualified pharmaceutical executive should have been able to answer without difficulty. Vincent's response confirmed everything Sophia had suspected about the relationship between his confidence and his competence. He deflected the question with generalizations about regulatory flexibility and market responsiveness, his answer revealing that he didn't understand the scientific concepts underlying his own presentation. When Sophia pressed for specific statistical methodologies, his irritation became obvious to the entire auditorium, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that wealthy men used when their authority was questioned by people they considered beneath them. "Security should screen these conference attendees more carefully," he said, his attempt at humor falling flat with an audience of professionals who understood the technical nature of her questions. The moment crystallized everything wrong with a system that elevated wealth over expertise. Vincent's financial success had granted him speaking authority about subjects he fundamentally misunderstood. Dr. Amanda Foster's intervention came from the front row, her voice carrying the particular authority that distinguished academic careers earned genuine professional respect in pharmaceutical circles. "Actually," she said, addressing Vincent directly, "those are excellent questions that go to the heart of responsible drug development. The statistical methodologies for clinical trial design are precisely the kind of technical details that determine whether treatments help or harm patients." Her attention turned to Sophia with the kind of recognition that felt like professional salvation, an acknowledgement that her questions reflected genuine expertise rather than presumptuous curiosity. Dr. Foster's position as conference organizer and director of pharmaceutical research at Columbia University made her validation particularly significant. This was someone whose opinion carried weight with regulatory agencies and industry professionals whose decisions affected drug development priorities. The brief conversation that followed Vincent's presentation felt like stepping into a parallel universe where expertise mattered more than wealth, where technical knowledge commanded respect regardless of the social position of the person who possessed it. Dr. Foster's questions about Sophia's background revealed a mind that could distinguish between genuine scientific training and superficial familiarity with pharmaceutical terminology. Her follow-up inquiries demonstrating the kind of intellectual rigor that characterized serious academic research. When Sophia mentioned her MIT doctorate and thesis research on targeted cancer therapeutics, Dr. Foster's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine excitement. This was someone who understood both the technical significance of the work and its potential applications for patient treatment. The conversation concluded with an invitation that felt like a lifeline. Would Sophia be interested in participating in tomorrow's panel discussion on women in pharmaceutical research? The panel opportunity represented everything Sophia had hoped for when she'd used her student credentials to access the conference. A chance to contribute her expertise to conversations that shaped drug development priorities. An opportunity to demonstrate professional competence in a context that valued scientific knowledge over social position. Dr. Foster explained that the panel would be live-streamed to pharmaceutical professionals worldwide, providing visibility for emerging researchers whose work could influence industry best practices. The timing felt almost mystical in its appropriateness. Less than 24 hours after Vincent's viral humiliation had destroyed her service job and threatened her professional reputation, she was being offered a platform to present her research to exactly the audience that could validate her expertise and restore her career prospects. But the invitation also carried implications that extended beyond personal vindication or professional opportunity. The panel would include Vincent as a special guest, his presence designed to provide industry perspective on academic research applications. Dr. Foster mentioned this detail with the casual assumption that pharmaceutical executives and research scientists could engage in productive dialogue about drug development priorities, her confidence in professional courtesy, revealing how little she understood about Vincent's character or his approach to people whose expertise threatened his authority. Sophia accepted the invitation with full awareness that she would be entering an arena where her scientific knowledge would be directly confronted by Vincent's wealth and social position, where the viral humiliation that had destroyed her service career could be either overcome through demonstrated expertise or amplified through another recorded performance of his casual cruelty. The evening provided time to prepare for a confrontation that would determine whether expertise could triumph over wealth in a society that consistently chose money over merit. Sophia spent hours reviewing her thesis research, preparing presentation materials that could demonstrate the practical applications of her work for cancer treatment development. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was preparing to defend scientific methodology to an audience that should have shared her commitment to patient safety and responsible drug development. But Vincent's keynote presentation had revealed how thoroughly financial considerations could corrupt professional judgment in pharmaceutical circles. Tomorrow's panel would test whether her expertise was sufficient to overcome the social advantages that Vincent's wealth had provided him throughout his career. Whether scientific knowledge could prevail over recorded humiliation in determining whose voice carried authority in conversations about treatment that could affect thousands of cancer patients. The morning of the panel discussion arrived with the weight of institutional pressure that Sophia had learned to recognize during her years navigating academic and professional spaces where her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. Dr. Amanda Foster's email had arrived at 6 o'clock with final details about the live-streamed presentation. An audience of pharmaceutical professionals worldwide, topics ranging from research methodology to industry applications, and Vincent Ashford's participation as special guest to provide commercial perspective on academic findings. The format was designed to facilitate productive dialogue between researchers and industry executives. Dr. Foster's faith in professional courtesy apparently unshaken by Vincent's demonstrated approach to people whose expertise challenged his authority. Sophia read the email while sitting on her apartment floor, her second-hand blazer and pressed slacks laid out like armor for a battle she wasn't certain she could win. The preparation process felt like studying for an examination that would determine not just her professional future, but her fundamental right to participate in conversations about subjects where her knowledge exceeded that of people whose wealth granted them automatic authority. Her thesis research formed the foundation, 3 years of work on targeted cancer therapeutics that complemented exactly the kind of compounds Vincent intended to acquire through financial leverage rather than scientific understanding. But the presentation needed to accomplish more than demonstrating her expertise. It needed to expose the dangers of his approach in ways that pharmaceutical professionals would find compelling enough to question acquisition strategies that prioritized profit over patient safety. The challenge was communicating complex scientific concepts to an audience whose technical knowledge varied widely, while avoiding the kind of academic jargon that could be dismissed as theoretical indulgence. The Jacob Javits Convention Center felt different as Sophia arrived for her second day at the conference. No longer an outsider observing conversations about pharmaceutical development, but a participant whose voice could influence industry discussions about research priorities and commercial applications. The exhibition hall buzzed with conversations about the previous day's presentations. Vincent's keynote generating particular discussion among executives who seemed excited about applying his streamlined development methods to their own acquisition strategies. The enthusiasm for approaches that could accelerate drug development by eliminating safety protocols felt ominous given the stakes involved. Every conversation about compressed clinical trials and regulatory flexibility represented potential consequences for cancer patients whose treatment options could be affected by decisions made in conference rooms by people who would never personally face the risks they were creating. Dr. Foster's pre-panel briefing took place in a small conference room adjacent to the main auditorium. The other participants arriving with the casual confidence of people accustomed to speaking about their expertise to professional audiences. Dr. Rachel Weiss from Johns Hopkins discussed her work on immunotherapy approaches. Dr. Maria Santos from Stanford presented research on drug resistance mechanisms, and Dr. Jennifer Park from Harvard outlined novel delivery systems for targeted therapies. Their conversation flowed with the easy familiarity of professionals who shared common training, methodological approaches, and commitment to rigorous scientific standards. Sophia found herself simultaneously intimidated by their credentials and reassured by their obvious expertise. These were people whose work could provide context for her own research while demonstrating the kind of careful methodology that Vincent's approach threatened to undermine. Vincent's arrival transformed the atmosphere with the particular energy that wealthy men brought to conversations where their authority was assumed rather than earned. His greeting to Dr. Foster carried the casual familiarity of someone accustomed to being the most important person in professional gatherings. His acknowledgement of the other panelists perfunctory in its indifference to their actual qualifications or achievements. When his attention focused on Sophia, his expression shifted to the kind of recognition that suggested unfinished business rather than professional courtesy. "Interesting," he said, his voice carrying implications that everyone in the room could hear, but no one except Sophia fully understood. "Dr. Foster mentioned you have experience in service industry customer relations as well as academic research. That's certainly a unique combination of qualifications." The was designed to remind everyone present of the viral humiliation that had cost Sophia her restaurant job while establishing the social hierarchy that placed his wealth above her expertise. The panel format provided structured opportunities for each participant to present their research and respond to questions from both the live audience and the global pharmaceutical community watching the live stream. Dr. Weiss opened with immunotherapy findings that demonstrated promising approaches to treatment-resistant cancers. Her presentation combining technical precision with clear explanations of clinical applications. Dr. Santos followed with research on molecular mechanisms underlying drug resistance, her work offering potential solutions to one of oncology's most persistent challenges. Dr. Park presented delivery system innovations that could improve treatment efficacy while reducing side effects, her findings directly relevant to pharmaceutical companies seeking to improve existing therapeutic approaches. Each presentation reflected years of careful research, methodological rigor, and commitment to advancing patient care through responsible scientific investigation. Sophia's presentation occupied the fourth position, her research on targeted cancer therapeutics positioned as foundational work that supported the clinical applications described by her fellow panelists. She began with molecular mechanisms underlying tumor development, explaining how understanding cellular pathways could lead to more effective treatment approaches with fewer side effects. Her slides displayed 3 years of laboratory work, protein interactions, therapeutic targets, efficacy measurements that demonstrated genuine promise for improving cancer treatment outcomes. The technical content was solid, methodologically sound, and directly relevant to pharmaceutical development. But the presentation's real purpose was establishing her expertise as comparable to that of her distinguished colleagues, while laying groundwork for what would follow. The audience's attention was respectful, their questions technically sophisticated, and their recognition of her competence evident in the quality of professional dialogue her research generated. Vincent's response period was designed to provide industry perspective on the academic research that had been presented. His role as special guest intended to bridge the gap between scientific discovery and commercial application. His commentary on the other presentations was superficially informed, focusing on market potential and development timelines without addressing the methodological considerations that determined whether treatments would actually work in clinical settings. When his attention turned to Sophia's research, his tone shifted to the patronizing condescension that characterized his approach to people whose expertise threatened his authority. Dr. Bennett's work represents exactly the kind of academic research that benefits from real-world business perspective, he said, his emphasis on her title carrying subtle mockery. Laboratory findings are interesting, but practical application requires understanding market dynamics that aren't typically covered in graduate programs. The moment of confrontation arrived when Vincent began describing his own company's acquisition strategy, outlining plans to purchase smaller biotech firms whose research could be streamlined for accelerated market entry. His description of the Boston company he intended to acquire matched exactly the therapeutic approaches that Sophia's research supported. But his explanation of development plans revealed the same fundamental misunderstandings that had characterized his keynote presentation. He spoke about compressing clinical trial phases, about regulatory flexibility that could expedite patient access, about safety protocols that represented excessive caution rather than necessary patient protection. The pharmaceutical professionals in the audience listened with apparent interest. Their questions focused on implementation rather than the underlying assumptions that made his approach dangerous for patient safety. Sophia's rebuttal came during the final question period, her hand rising with the calculated timing of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from genuine expertise rather than inherited wealth. "Your acquisition strategy raises concerns about patient safety that aren't addressed by accelerated development timelines. Could you explain how compressing Phase 2 and Phase 3 trials maintains the statistical power necessary to detect serious adverse effects that might not manifest until treatments reach larger patient populations?" The question was designed to expose the fundamental flaws in his methodology while demonstrating her own understanding of clinical trial design, statistical significance, and regulatory requirements that protected patients from treatments that hadn't been adequately tested for safety and efficacy. Vincent's response confirmed everything Sophia had understood about the relationship between his confidence and his competence. He deflected with generalizations about regulatory capture and bureaucratic obstacles, his answer revealing that he didn't understand the scientific concepts underlying his own acquisition strategy. When she pressed for specific methodological details, his irritation became obvious to the entire auditorium, his voice taking on the aggressive tone that wealthy men used when their authority was questioned by people they considered beneath them. "This is exactly what I mean about academic perspectives," he said, his attempt to dismiss her expertise falling flat with an audience of professionals who could recognize legitimate scientific inquiry. Theoretical concerns about statistical methodology ignore the practical reality that patients are dying while researchers debate sample sizes and observation periods. The exchange crystallized for everyone present that Vincent's pharmaceutical expertise was superficial at best, his confident assertions about drug development revealing fundamental ignorance of why safety protocols existed in the first place. The live stream audience had grown to include thousands of pharmaceutical professionals whose decisions shaped drug development priorities, regulatory oversight, and patient access to cancer treatments worldwide. Sophia watched the viewer count climb on the monitor beside the main stage, while Vincent concluded his dismissive response to her questions about clinical trial methodology. His confident ignorance now documented for a global audience of experts who could recognize the difference between genuine pharmaceutical knowledge and superficial familiarity with industry terminology. The weight of opportunity felt enormous. This was her chance to demonstrate not just her own expertise, but the dangerous implications of Vincent's acquisition strategy for patients whose lives depended on responsible drug development. The irony wasn't lost on her that viral technology, which had amplified her humiliation and destroyed her service career, could now amplify her expertise and validate her professional competence. Dr. Foster's introduction of the extended question period provided Sophia with the platform she needed to transform the confrontation from personal vindication to professional obligation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the particular authority that came from years of rigorous scientific training, "I'd like to address the specific claims Mr. Ashford has made about streamlining pharmaceutical development, because the methodology he's describing has implications that extend far beyond theoretical academic concerns." Her presentation materials appeared on the main screen. Clinical trial data, statistical analyses, regulatory requirements that protected patients from treatments that hadn't been adequately tested for safety and efficacy. The audience's attention shifted from polite interest to genuine engagement as they recognized the technical sophistication of her preparation and the professional implications of what she was presenting. The systematic dismantling of Vincent's pharmaceutical expertise began with basic clinical trial design, Sophia explaining why Phase 2 and Phase 3 trials required specific sample sizes, observation periods, and statistical methodologies to detect adverse effects that could affect patient safety. Her slides displayed actual data from drug development programs that had failed when safety protocols were compromised by commercial pressure, treatments that had caused serious harm to patients when financial considerations overrode scientific methodology. The pharmaceutical professionals in the audience began asking technical questions that demonstrated their growing understanding of why Vincent's streamlined approach was dangerous. Their inquiries revealing professional concerns about acquisition strategies that prioritized profit over patient protection. The conversation was shifting from academic discussion to industry alarm as the implications of Vincent's methodology became clear to people whose decisions affected treatment options for thousands of cancer patients. Vincent's attempts to deflect criticism revealed the depth of his ignorance about subjects he'd been confidently discussing with pharmaceutical executives and venture capitalists for months. When Sophia questioned his understanding of statistical significance in clinical trials, he responded with generalizations about regulatory flexibility that demonstrated he didn't understand why FDA requirements existed in the first place. When she pressed him about adverse effect monitoring, his answer revealed that he considered patient safety protocols to be bureaucratic obstacles rather than essential protections for people whose lives depended on responsible drug development. The audience's questions became increasingly technical and increasingly skeptical, their professional expertise allowing them to recognize that Vincent's confident assertions were fundamentally unsound from both scientific and regulatory perspectives. The presentation reached its crescendo when Sophia displayed specific evidence of Vincent's company's acquisition targets, the Boston biotech firms whose innovative cancer treatments he intended to purchase and fast-track through development by eliminating safety protocols. Her research had identified the therapeutic compounds he planned to acquire, novel approaches to targeted cancer therapy that represented genuine breakthroughs in treatment methodology. But her analysis of his development plans revealed systematic disregard for clinical trial requirements, patient safety monitoring, and FDA oversight that could transform promising treatments into dangerous failures. The pharmaceutical professionals in the audience recognized the compounds she was discussing, several asking questions that revealed their own familiarity with the research and their alarm about acquisition strategies that could compromise patient safety for financial gain. The psychological confrontation between expertise and wealth reached its peak when Vincent's composure finally cracked under the sustained technical questioning from an audience that could distinguish between genuine pharmaceutical knowledge and superficial familiarity with industry terminology. His voice rose to the aggressive volume that wealthy men used when their authority was challenged by people they considered beneath them, his accusations about academic arrogance and theoretical indulgence falling flat with professionals who understood the practical implications of what Sophia was presenting. "This is exactly why outsiders shouldn't be making decisions about pharmaceutical development," he said, his attempt to dismiss her expertise revealing the depth of his own insecurity about technical subjects he didn't understand. The irony was perfect. He was calling her an outsider while she demonstrated pharmaceutical expertise that far exceeded his own understanding of drug development methodology. The moment of complete professional demolition arrived when Vincent made the strategic error of questioning Sophia's qualifications to discuss pharmaceutical development with an audience of industry experts. "Let's be honest about what we're dealing with here," he said, his voice carrying the particular venom that wealthy men reserved for people whose competence threatened their social position. "This is someone whose professional experience consists of carrying plates and memorizing orders. She's playing scientist the same way she played Waitress, following scripts without understanding the complexity of real-world applications." His words triggered the kind of silence that preceded professional catastrophe, the entire auditorium recognizing that he'd just dismissed genuine expertise based on service work that had no bearing on scientific qualifications. The pharmaceutical professionals in the audience understood exactly what they were witnessing: wealth attempting to discredit competence through class-based humiliation. Sophia's response came with the calm precision of someone whose expertise had been thoroughly documented for a global audience of professionals capable of evaluating her competence independently of Vincent's social position. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice carrying 3 years of rigorous scientific training and 6 years of experience navigating institutional spaces that valued merit over social position. "My professional experience includes a doctorate in biochemistry from MIT, 3 years of research on targeted cancer therapeutics, and peer-reviewed publications that address exactly the therapeutic targets your acquisition strategy threatens to compromise. Your professional experience appears to consist primarily of inherited wealth and confident assertions about subjects you demonstrably don't understand." The words landed with surgical precision, each point supported by evidence that had been presented to an audience qualified to evaluate their technical accuracy and professional significance. The aftermath unfolded with the inevitable momentum of expertise confronting ignorance in front of witnesses qualified to recognize the difference. Pharmaceutical executives in the audience began distancing themselves from acquisition strategies they'd previously found attractive, their questions revealing growing concern about regulatory oversight and patient safety implications. Venture capitalists who'd been interested in Vincent's streamlined development methodology started asking technical questions about FDA requirements and clinical trial design that he couldn't answer with specificity or accuracy. Regulatory consultants whose client relationships depended on maintaining professional credibility began expressing reservations about approaches that could attract unwanted attention from oversight agencies concerned about patient protection. The systematic collapse of professional support was stunning in its completeness. Vincent's wealth couldn't compensate for expertise he didn't possess when evaluated by people qualified to recognize the difference. The live stream audience's reaction was immediate and devastating. Comments from pharmaceutical professionals worldwide, expressing alarm about acquisition strategies that prioritized profit over patient safety. Industry publications that had previously featured Vincent's opinions about drug development began publishing articles that questioned his qualifications and highlighted the technical concerns that Sophia had raised about his methodology. Regulatory agencies that monitored pharmaceutical acquisition activity started asking questions about companies whose development plans appeared to circumvent established safety protocols. The viral amplification that had destroyed Sophia's service career now worked in reverse, spreading evidence of Vincent's professional incompetence to exactly the audience whose opinions could affect his business prospects and industry reputation. The irony was perfect in its symmetry. Technology that had been used to humiliate her was now documenting his humiliation in front of people whose professional judgment actually mattered for pharmaceutical development. The transformation began immediately after the live stream concluded. Pharmaceutical professionals approaching Sophia with the kind of respectful interest that genuine expertise commanded in circles where technical knowledge determined professional value. Dr. Foster's introduction facilitated conversations with regulatory officials, industry executives, and research directors whose combined influence shaped drug development priorities across the healthcare sector. Their questions were sophisticated, their recognition of her competence immediate, and their interest in her research applications professionally significant. The contrast with Vincent's recorded humiliation of her service work felt surreal. Less than 48 hours after being dismissed as intellectually incapable of understanding complex subjects, she was being courted by people whose decisions affected cancer treatment for thousands of patients worldwide. Vincent's departure from the conference occurred with the particular haste that characterized wealthy people confronting consequences they hadn't anticipated. His entourage of pharmaceutical executives and venture capitalists dispersing with the efficiency of professionals whose reputations depended on distancing themselves from association with demonstrable incompetence. The regulatory consultant who'd accompanied him to the restaurant had already begun making phone calls that suggested damage control rather than continued collaboration. The venture capitalist whose healthcare investments had included Vincent's acquisition targets was asking pointed questions about due diligence and technical oversight that implied serious reconsideration of their financial relationship. The pharmaceutical executive who'd encouraged his streamlined development methodology was suddenly unavailable for follow-up meetings that had been scheduled before Sophia's systematic demolition of their shared assumptions about drug development priorities. The afternoon brought a cascade of professional opportunities that felt like stepping into a parallel universe where expertise mattered more than social position, where technical knowledge commanded respect regardless of the economic circumstances that had required its possessor to work in service industries while pursuing advanced education. Industry executives wanted to discuss research applications, regulatory officials asked about clinical trial methodology, and pharmaceutical companies inquired about consulting opportunities that could apply her expertise to their development programs. Dr. Foster facilitated introductions that led to conversations about postdoctoral positions, research collaborations, and industry partnerships that recognized her contributions to cancer therapeutic development. The recognition felt almost overwhelming in its completeness. Every professional connection that Vincent's humiliation had threatened was being restored through demonstrated competence rather than inherited wealth. The digital response exceeded even Sophia's most optimistic expectations for vindication. The live stream recording generating millions of views across platforms that specialized in content about professional expertise, triumphing over social prejudice. Comments from pharmaceutical professionals, cancer researchers, and medical practitioners provided technical validation of her presentation while expressing alarm about acquisition strategies that prioritized profit over patient safety. Industry publications featured articles about the importance of scientific oversight in drug development. Regulatory agencies announced investigations of pharmaceutical acquisition practices, and professional organizations began discussing standards for technical competence in industry leadership positions. The viral amplification that had destroyed her service career was now amplifying recognition of her expertise to global audiences whose opinions actually mattered for her professional future. The investigation that followed Vincent's public exposure moved with the methodical precision that regulatory agencies applied to pharmaceutical misconduct cases that could affect patient safety. FDA officials who'd viewed the live stream presentation began asking questions about his company's acquisition targets, development timelines, and clinical trial methodologies that revealed the kind of scrutiny that pharmaceutical executives feared most. Securities regulators started examining his public statements about drug development for potential investor fraud implications. Congressional committees concerned about pharmaceutical pricing and patient access began requesting documents about acquisition strategies that appeared to prioritize profit over safety protocols. The systematic examination of his business practices represented exactly the kind of institutional oversight that his wealth had previously insulated him from facing. The most satisfying aspect of Vincent's professional collapse was its organic emergence from his own recorded statements about pharmaceutical development. His confident assertions about streamlining clinical trials, providing evidence that regulatory agencies could use to evaluate his company's compliance with established safety protocols. The viral video that had documented Sophia's humiliation also contained his detailed explanation of acquisition strategies that violated FDA requirements, patient safety standards, and investor disclosure obligations. His performance art, intended to demonstrate social dominance over a service worker, had become evidence of professional incompetence that regulatory agencies could use to protect patients from dangerous development practices. The irony was perfect in its poetic justice. His casual cruelty had created the documentation necessary for his own professional destruction. The career offers that materialized throughout the following weeks reflected genuine recognition of Sophia's expertise, rather than sympathy for her previous humiliation. Pharmaceutical companies and research institutions competing for access to knowledge that could advance cancer treatment development through responsible scientific methodology. She received invitations to join clinical trial review boards, consulting contracts that applied her research to drug development programs, and academic positions that would allow her to continue advancing therapeutic approaches while training the next generation of cancer researchers. The financial security that had seemed impossible during her years of working service jobs while pursuing graduate education suddenly became not just achievable but abundant. Her expertise commanding compensation that reflected its actual value rather than the social position of its possessor. The choice she ultimately made reflected values that had sustained her through 6 years of graduate education while working jobs that required her to absorb casual humiliation from people whose wealth granted them authority over subjects they didn't understand. Instead of maximizing financial compensation through pharmaceutical industry positions that could have provided comfortable insulation from the economic uncertainty that had defined her young adult life, Sophia accepted an offer from a nonprofit research institute that focused on developing affordable cancer treatments for underserved patient populations. The decision represented everything she'd learned about the relationship between expertise and responsibility, the obligation that genuine knowledge created to use technical competence in service of people who needed help rather than corporations that needed profit maximization. The nonprofit position provided opportunities to mentor graduate students whose backgrounds reflected her own experience navigating academic institutions that weren't designed for people from working-class families. First-generation college students whose intellectual capabilities exceeded their economic resources. Her office became a gathering place for researchers whose expertise had been shaped by personal experience with healthcare systems that prioritized wealth over patient need. Scientists whose technical competence was combined with moral commitment to advancing treatments that could actually reach the people who needed them. The mentorship relationships felt like breaking cycles of class-based discrimination that had defined her own educational experience, creating pathways for expertise to emerge from backgrounds that academic institutions traditionally overlooked or dismissed. Vincent's ultimate fate provided closure that felt proportionate to both his casual cruelty and his professional incompetence. Regulatory investigations revealing systematic patterns of pharmaceutical misconduct that extended far beyond the specific acquisition strategies Sophia had exposed during the live-stream presentation. Securities fraud charges emerged from his public misrepresentations of drug development methodology to investors who trusted his claimed expertise about therapeutic applications. FDA violations accumulated from clinical trial shortcuts that had endangered patient safety in pursuit of accelerated market entry. Congressional investigations exposed acquisition practices that had inflated drug prices while compromising treatment efficacy through inadequate development oversight. The systematic examination of his business practices revealed exactly the kind of financially motivated recklessness that regulatory agencies existed to prevent. His wealth finally insufficient to insulate him from consequences that reflected the actual harm his ignorance had caused to patients whose lives depended on responsible pharmaceutical development.